The Old Testament story of the Exodus of the children of Israel is so rich with meaning that it bears frequent repetition and reflection on how it might apply to us and to future generations. Thankfully, the story has been preserved in oral and written tradition. Its preservation is a gift, useful as a guide for our daily lives. It provides us with an ongoing opportunity for deeper self-discovery. The following account is a summary of the scriptural record of the Exodus, with a few added reflections on the possible human responses to the political and spiritual changes experienced by the children of Israel approximately 3,200 years ago. The children of Israel, having migrated to Egypt several hundred years before their exodus, enjoyed the favor of the Pharaoh because of the political and administrative skills of their brother Joseph, who had been taken to Egypt against his will several years before their arrival. This favor was enjoyed even after the death of Joseph, until that Pharaoh died and was replaced by a new Pharaoh, who did not share his predecessor's fondness for them. Quoting from Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14 of the New American Bible, St. Joseph edition, "Then a new king who knew nothing of Joseph came to power in Egypt. He said to his subjects, 'Look how numerous and powerful the Israelite people are growing, more so than we ourselves. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them to stop their increase. Otherwise, in time of war, they too may join our enemies to fight against us, and so leave our country.' Accordingly, taskmasters were set over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. Thus they had to build for Pharaoh the supply cities of Pithom and Ramses. Yet the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. The Egyptians then dreaded the Israelites and reduced them to cruel slavery, making life bitter for them with hard work in mortar and brick and all kinds of field work, the whole cruel fate of slaves. What is the genesis of tyranny? From whence comes the mad desire to dominate others? How do tyrants gain control of other people's minds? Evil schemes, plans for reduction of your neighbor's strength through the clever use of charm, intimidation by threats of violence, clever deceit, manipulation. In this narrative, Pharaoh is demonstrating his divine nature by pretending, with help from his wizards, to control the movement of the sun, thereby showing nature's dependence on his command. Some are convinced, some are skeptical. Falsehood requires frequent grooming of its narrative and testing for possible flaws. During these episodes of narrative grooming, Pharaoh escapes into fantasy, pretending to be a great sportsman, skilled at fishing, to further demonstrate his power over nature. The wizards know that they are doomed if Pharaoh is not satisfied with the day's catch. They trick him by placing previously captured fish onto Pharaoh's line, making him think he has caught them unassisted. Thus the tyrant is played for the fool that he is. Meanwhile, back at the construction site, Moses witnesses a confrontation between an Israelite slave and soldiers intent on violent enforcement of the work requirement. Moses witnesses the murderous intent of the soldiers against the helpless Israelite slave. Moses continues to witness the violence inflicted on the Israelite until the Israelite slave is murdered by Pharaoh's soldier. Moses' anger demands revenge. On the following day, Moses kills the soldier, but there is a witness loyal to Pharaoh. Moses flees. Moses finds refuge in Midian, working for his father-in-law Jethro, taking care of his sheep. One day, while taking care of the sheep, Moses witnessed a frightening supernatural phenomenon, a burning bush which was not consumed by the fire, and a voice coming from the bush, which was the voice of Yahweh, commanding Moses to confront Pharaoh with the demand to release the Israelites from slavery. Moses was terrified by the prospect of an encounter with Pharaoh, and objected fearfully, claiming that Pharaoh would not listen. Finally, in desperation to escape from Yahweh's command, he cited his speech impediment. Yahweh insisted, saying he will provide a speaker for Moses, his brother-in-law Aaron. Of course, Moses obeyed Yahweh's command tentatively, with the further objection that his fellow Israelites would not believe him. Excerpts from Exodus 3 clarify the scene. When the Lord saw him, Moses, coming over to look at it, the burning bush, more closely, God called out from the burning bush, "Moses, Moses," he answered. "Here I am." God said, "Come no nearer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I am the God of your father." Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. But the Lord said, "I have witnessed the affliction of my people in Egypt, and have heard their cry of complaint against their slave drivers, so I know well what they are suffering." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt?" He answered, "I will be with you, and this shall be your proof that it is I who have sent you. When you bring my people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this very mountain." "But," said Moses to God, "when I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' if they ask me, 'What is his name?' what am I to tell them?" God replied, "I am who am." Then he added, "This is what you shall tell the Israelites. I am sent me to you." Moses confronts Pharaoh, exhorting him to let the Israelites go free. Pharaoh is unmoved by Moses' plea and by the plagues which follow. Finally, Yahweh sends an angel of death to kill every firstborn child, animal or human, not protected by blood from an unblemished lamb painted over the lintel of its dwelling. The angel is instructed to pass over dwellings bearing this mark, but to kill every firstborn being dwelling in an unmarked building. Thus Pharaoh is moved to not only let the Israelites go free, but he is exasperated by their presence and demands that they leave Egypt. Thus, after several generations of slavery, which left the Israelites totally ignorant of the traditional demands of freedom, they were set free to make their own decisions, without any recent memory or precedent to guide them. Their dependence suddenly shifted from a despotic Pharaoh, who treated them as subhuman slaves, to Moses, who received instruction from Yahweh, who loved and protected them with an unbreakable covenant, beginning with Yahweh's promise to Abraham centuries earlier, but who was invisible and therefore doubtable. The Israelites' trust in Moses was fragile at best. One can imagine their joy at having been set free. However, this euphoria was quickly replaced by confusion, anxiety, frustration, and finally anger, which led them to panic as they left their familiar surroundings to confront the frightening and unfamiliar demands of freedom. Moses, who they hardly knew and who they did not fully understand or trust, was leading them away from their homes across an unfamiliar land towards the banks of the sea, their next immediate barrier, a place of chaos and danger. Did they wonder if boats would be available to take them across the water? And if so, as they came closer to the water's edge, they could see no boats. Anxiety must have accelerated exponentially, but they reluctantly followed Moses. There was no reasonable alternative. They had been released from the brutal grip of a tyrant, only to be at the mercy of Moses, who they reckoned was completely mad. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, Pharaoh's relief at the removal of the odious Israelites soon changed to fear, anxiety, and anger when he realized that he had suddenly lost his workforce. He must have asked in panic, "Who will do the work? The construction has not been completed. I must get them back." From Exodus chapter 14, verse 5, when it was reported to the king of Egypt that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants changed their minds about them. "What have we done?" they exclaimed. "Why, we have released Israel from our service." So Pharaoh made his chariots ready and mustered his soldiers. So obstinate had the Lord made Pharaoh that he pursued the Israelites even while they were marching away in triumph. Perhaps as the Israelites reached the water's edge, they stopped and contemplated the worst, for Pharaoh's army could be seen moving in their direction. Surely this was the end of the children of Israel. Surely they felt trapped and betrayed by Moses' actions. Were there some suicides at this point? The biblical account does not say, but certainly faith in Yahweh's covenant was tested to and in some cases beyond the breaking point. Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 14. Pharaoh was already near when the Israelites looked up and saw that the Egyptians were on the march in pursuit of them. In great fright they cried out to the Lord, and they complained to Moses, "Were there no burial places in Egypt that you had to bring us out here to die in the desert? Why did you do this to us? Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Did we not tell you this in Egypt when we said, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? Far better for us to be slaves of the Egyptians than to die in the desert." But Moses answered the people, "Fear not, stand your ground, and you will see the victory the Lord will win for you today. These Egyptians whom you see today you will never see again. The Lord himself will fight for you. You have only to keep still." The biblical account from Exodus chapter 14, verses 15 through 31. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, and you lift up your staff and, with hand outstretched over the sea, split the sea in two, that the Israelites may pass through it on dry land. But I will make the Egyptians so obstinate that they will go in after them. Then I will receive glory through Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and charioteers. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh and his chariots and charioteers." The angel of God, who had been leading Israel's camp, now moved and went around behind them. The column of cloud also, leading from the front, took up its place behind them, so that it came between the camp of the Egyptians and that of Israel. But the cloud now became dark, and thus the night passed, without the rival camps coming any closer together all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea with a strong east wind throughout the night, and so turned it into dry land. When the water was thus divided, the Israelites marched into the midst of the sea on dry land, with the water like a wall to their right and to their left. The Egyptians followed in pursuit. All Pharaoh's horses and chariots and charioteers went after them right into the midst of the sea. In the night watch, just before dawn, the Lord cast through the column of the fiery cloud upon the Egyptian force a glance that threw it into a panic, and he so clogged their chariot wheels that they could hardly drive. With that the Egyptians sounded the retreat before Israel, because the Lord was fighting for them against the Egyptians. Then the Lord told Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may flow back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and charioteers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea flowed back to its normal depth. The Egyptians were fleeing head-on toward the sea, when the Lord hurled them into its midst. As the water flowed back, it covered the chariots and the charioteers of Pharaoh's whole army which had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not a single one of them escaped. But the Israelites had marched on dry land through the midst of the sea, with the water to their right and to their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel on that day from the power of the Egyptians. When Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the seashore, and beheld the great power that the Lord had shown against the Egyptians, they feared the Lord and believed in him and in his servant Moses. One challenge followed another: slavery, miraculous release, uncertain itinerary and survival of the rigors of desert life, thirst, fatigue, hunger, disease, and the invasion of sand into every bodily crevice. At sunrise the next day, after safely crossing the Red Sea, they continued their journey into the desert. By midday, the burning heat from the sun became unbearable because there was no protection from its direct rays. After sunset, the heat captured by the sand during the day radiated into the atmosphere, causing temperatures to plummet, requiring protection from the cold. Fuel for fires is scarce in the desert, thus they had no comfort. Lack of food and water were also constant challenges. From Exodus chapter 16, verse 1. Having set out from Elim, the whole Israelite community came into the desert of Sin. Here in the desert the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "Would that we had died at the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, as we sat by our flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. But you had to lead us into this desert to make the whole community die of famine." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will now rain down bread from heaven for you. Each day the people are to go out and gather their daily portion. Thus will I test them to see whether they follow my instructions or not." From Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. From the desert of Sin the whole Israelite community journeyed in stages, as the Lord directed, and encamped at Rephidim. Here there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled, therefore, with Moses, and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to a test?" Here then, in their thirst for water, the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "Why did you ever make us leave Egypt? Was it just to have us die here of thirst with our children and our livestock?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? A little more and they will stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go over there in front of the people, along with some of the elders of Israel, holding in your hand as you go the staff with which you struck the river. I will be standing in front of you on the rock in Horeb. Strike the rock, and the water will flow from it for the people to drink." This Moses did in the presence of the elders of Israel. The place was called Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled there and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord in our midst or not?" From Exodus chapter 19. In the 3rd month after their departure from the land of Egypt, on its first day, the Israelites came to the desert of Sinai. After the journey from Rephidim to the desert of Sinai, they pitched camp. While Israel was encamped here in front of the mountain, Moses went up the mountain to God. Then the Lord called to him and said, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, Tell the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves how I treated the Egyptians, and how I bore you up on eagle's wings and brought you here to myself. Therefore, if you hearken to my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my special possession, dearer to me than all other people, though all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." That is what you must tell the Israelites. To this the people responded. The people all answered together, "Everything the Lord has said we will do." Then Moses brought back to the Lord the response of the people. However, in Moses' absence, old fears began to rise and dominate the minds of the people. Skepticism mounted until it was decided that Yahweh's covenant was no longer valid, if indeed it had ever been real. So it was decided, with Aaron's approval, to melt the jewelry they had taken from the Egyptians, and mold a golden calf which they would worship. After all, gold is a very precious metal, bringing a high price in any market. They would worship the golden calf which at least they could see with their own eyes. Faith vanished. And so they did, making music for singing and dancing, and they gave their allegiance to an object of their own making. Until, as Moses descended Mount Horeb, carrying Yahweh's gift of the law, from Exodus chapter 32, verses 15 and 16, the 2 tablets in his hands, tablets that were written on both sides, front and back, tablets that were made by God. He heard sounds of merriment which did not bode well for him. When Moses reached the foot of the mountain, he saw the calf and the dancing. With that, Moses' wrath flared up so that he threw the tablets down and broke them on the base of the mountain. Taking the calf they had made, he fused it in the fire and then ground it into powder, which he scattered on the water and made the Israelites drink. Moses asked Aaron, "What did this people ever do to you that you should lead them to so grave a sin?" Aaron replied, "Let not my Lord be angry. You know well enough how prone the people are to evil. They said to me, 'Make us a god to be our leader.' As for the man Moses, who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. So I told them, 'Let anyone who has gold jewelry take it off.' They gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and this calf came out." So Moses said to the people, "Whoever is for the Lord, let him come to me." All the Levites then rallied to him, and he told them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, put your sword on your hip, every one of you. Now go up and down the camp, from gate to gate, and slay your own kinsmen, your friends and neighbors." The Levites carried out the command of Moses, and that day there fell about 3,000 of the people. Then Moses said, "Today you have been dedicated to the Lord, for you were against your own sons and kinsmen, to bring a blessing upon yourselves this day." From Exodus chapter 34. The Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 stone tablets like the former, that I may write on them the commandments which were on the former tablets which you broke." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write down these words, for in accordance with them I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." So Moses returned to the mountain. After spending 40 days and nights on the mountain conversing with the Lord, Moses came down the mountain and explained their covenant relationship with God through the law, saying, I call heaven and earth today to witness against you. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life then, that you and your descendants may live, by loving the Lord your God, heeding his voice, and holding fast to him. Thus the people began to understand and to accept their special relationship to God through the law, known as the 10 Commandments. But as we all know, this was only a beginning, a story that continues to this moment, with one enduring quality, hope.